Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first lesson of our equality unit, in which we will discuss the causes of the Civil War. That's a two-lesson unit, and then we'll have two lessons on the Civil War itself. Our first essential question, which will cover what we're learning about in the next two lessons, is how did the United States careen towards civil war? And if you've never heard the word careen before, careening is what your car does when you're driving on black ice and you try to turn and the car decides to go a different direction than you actually want to go. You've lost control and your car is careening. And in a sense, that's exactly what the United States did as we hurtled towards civil war. Something we had tried to avoid for almost 90 years eventually became unavoidable, and you're about to find out why. So our first left side questions will be, what were the seeds of conflict? How did this conflict begin? And those pictures tell a story. And most people, if they know anything about the Civil War, immediately mention slavery as a reason, and with good cause. Let's go ahead and discuss this. From the very first days of the country, back when the Declaration of Independence was signed and when the Constitution was written, the North and the South as regions were divided over the issue of slavery. And I very likely had you compare and contrast the differences between the North and the South, looking at their geography, looking at their economy, looking at their transportation, and looking at their culture. So hopefully at this point you have a sense of why there was division between those two regions of the country. In many ways, they were like two countries trying to live under the same flag, and they reached a point at which they could not do that anymore. So, as you know, the Southern economy was based on agriculture, and agriculture requires lots of labor, and it requires that labor to be cheap. And right, wrong, or in between, slavery is the cheapest form of labor, and so the Southern economy was very based on slave labor, which helped keep their labor costs down so that they could sell their cotton or their food for the lowest price possible. The North did not have such a need. The North did not have very much agriculture at all. What agriculture it did have was not based on plantations, and therefore the North did not need slaves, and so it's easy to object morally to something that you don't need yourself. Kind of like in today's world, people would say it's easy to object morally to fossil fuels if you don't live in a state that relies on fossil fuel extraction for its economic engine, like the American South or West Virginia. So, in reality, as I've already stated, the North and South were like two countries trying to live under the same flag, and as you're about to discover, it reached a point where they no longer could justify doing so. Our next left side question is, how did compromise kick the can down the road? The Three-Fifths Compromise, which you may remember from the Constitutional Convention, declared that all slaves would count as 3/5 of a person in terms of a state's population for being included in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives they would get. And that compromise was essential for the Constitution to be ratified or approved in the first place. If that compromise did not occur, we would probably not have the Constitution of the United States. So as ugly as it was, it accomplished a task at the time. However, it also put a ticking time bomb into the Constitution. Every time a new slave state entered the Union, a new free state had to enter the Union as well. So every time we added states, we tended to add them in twos so that there would be one state that would enter and essentially side with the North, while another state would enter and essentially side with the South. And the reason for that is the Senate. In the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, And so the idea here was that no one side could outvote the other side in the Senate, and therefore there would be balance. The slaves states could not force slavery on the entire country, and the abolitionist states could not abolish slavery everywhere. It was a very, very tender balance, one could say. And the vice president was never put in a position to have to break a tie on this issue, which could have made it very interesting. Since each state got 2 senators, the balance always needed to be 50-50, which is more or less what I just said. Now, these days we actually have 100 senators, so it's literally 50-50. Back then, 50-50 was more of a percentage thing because we had far fewer states. So in order to keep that 50-50 balance, many compromises were made to keep the number of slave and free states equal. And today you're going to learn about 2 of those compromises. Starting with, wait for it, the Compromise of 1820. We're going to ask ourselves the question, what was the Compromise of 1820? The first thing you should know is the Compromise of 1820 is also known as the Missouri Compromise. So if you ever hear the phrase Missouri Compromise, it is referring to the Compromise of 1820. And the map on the left kind of graphically shows you the end result of the Compromise of 1820. Keep in mind, 1820 is largely before Manifest Destiny was realized. If you did the Trail of Tears or the Louisiana Purchase for your social studies analysis, you can see the lands in question for those papers are included here. But if you did the Texas annexation, the Mexican-American War, or the Oregon Treaty, you will notice that your time has not yet come. Basically, the first thing the Compromise of 1820 did is it kept the balance in the Senate even at 50-50. Maine became a state. It was split off from Massachusetts, and it became a free state. So up until this point, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts. In this case, Maine was split off, given its own statehood, given 2 senators, and it was a free state. This allowed the state of Missouri to come into the Union and be admitted as a slave state, so the balance could be maintained. So Maine and Missouri both became states. Arkansas Territory, Arkansas was not yet a state, was created, and it was opened to slavery. So even though Arkansas was not a state, the territory was created, and slaves were allowed in that territory. However, everything north of an imaginary line that became known as the Mason-Dixon line was kept free. So the Mason-Dixon line is an imaginary line between north and south. This would be the Mason-Dixon line right here. So if you were to extend it all the way across, it would go like that and would essentially become what is now the Oregon-California border. So that's always been the imaginary line between north and south, especially when you're on the eastern side of the country. This lovely little list of things is something you will need to know for the test, and these things are the outgrowth of what we call the Compromise of 1820, also known as the Missouri Compromise. So then there was something called the nullification crisis. So our next left side question is, what was nullification and what was states' rights? This was a crisis that almost led to the Civil War before the Civil War happened, and it had to do with South Carolina being very upset about a federal tariff. So I'm about to tell you who that angry man is in the picture. The picture there is the flag of South Carolina, if you didn't already know that, which you probably don't. In 1828 and 1832, the federal government passed a tariff on imported British goods. So if you don't know what a tariff is a tax on things coming in from outside the country. President Trump really loves tariffs. He's placed tariffs on just about everything. It's been very interesting. In this case, the tariff made anything coming in from Great Britain or England much more expensive. And that helped some regions of the country, and it hurt others. South Carolina hated the tariff because it hurt them and made their goods more expensive, and it made it more expensive for them to buy things from England, which they really wanted to do. So the legislature of South Carolina decided, you know what? We're going to pass a law that says that that tariff will not be enforced within the borders of South Carolina. That's called nullification. To nullify a law is to not enforce it within the boundaries of a state. So essentially, South Carolina went against the federal government. A state passed a law that went against the national law, and it therefore became a challenge to the Constitution. In most cases, a federal law will trump, no pun intended, a state law. So for example, the states that allow legalized cannabis consumption are technically nullifying a federal prohibition on recreational marijuana. But the federal government hasn't decided to be aggressive about that. So it's kind of a soft nullification. So South Carolina believed that it could choose not to enforce a federal law within its borders because of states' rights. So whenever you hear people talk about states' rights, they're saying whatever the people of a state wants, their state government has a right to stand up for them. And if that means going up against the federal government, then so be it. The states' rights people believe the states should have equal or more power than the federal government. And sometimes you might agree with the states' rights argument if it happens to be arguing for something you're for, whereas at other times you might find yourself really opposing states' rights arguments. So it really depends what the issue is to decide how people feel about it, which means the underlying theoretical question of whether the states should have more power or the federal government should have more power is less important to most people than whether they get their way. So John C. Calhoun, that's the angry man you see there. He was Vice President of the United States under Andrew Jackson. He's the guy on your $20 bill. He's the guy made famous by the Trail of Tears. So there's about 20% of you in the room who know something about Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun was his vice president, and he was the leader of the nullification forces. So he was Vice President of the United States, but in this case, he was acting as a South Carolina leader. He literally resigned the job of vice president to protest against this federal tariff. So he gave up his job to stand with his state. So he literally did not have a vice president once he resigned. The national government then threatened to enforce the tariff with the military. So Andrew Jackson, who was a Southerner, so this was kind of difficult for him, he stepped up and said, we're sending the military in to make sure this tariff is enforced and federal law is followed. So the states' rights cannot trump the federal rights. Rather than challenge this, South Carolina decided to back down and not nullify that tariff. But let's just say they were none too happy about it. And you'll be hearing about South Carolina again, not too far down the road. Final left side question of today. We're dividing this unit in two, so this is our final question of today. What was the Compromise of 1850? And this is a compromise that also allowed new states into the Union, and it also helped maintain the balance in the Senate. You will notice at this point that the Texas annexation has happened, the Mexican-American War has happened, and the Oregon Treaty has happened because Manifest Destiny has been realized, and the United States now spreads from the sea to shining sea. After the Mexican-American War, the new territory was ripe for conflict. We no longer had any place left to expand. We took half of Mexico away from Mexico, and at this point we'd formed a treaty establishing the border with Canada, so we were pretty content because we expanded from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So now it was time to decide what was going to happen to all this new land. And the slave forces and the abolitionist forces started to realize that once we come up with these compromises, there won't be any place left to look to solve our problems, which is a problem in and of itself. Texas was admitted to the Union as a slave state. Texas became a southern state. Slavery was allowed in Texas. One of the reasons Texas rebelled against Mexico is the Texas settlers wanted to have slaves. And Mexico, to its credit, abolished slavery way before we did in the United States. And that actually made the American settlers who had moved to Texas and had moved to Mexico rather upset. California was admitted as a free state, and that was a little bit controversial because a good portion of California is actually south of the Mason-Dixon line, so this was essentially allowing a free state to come into the Union that was technically south of the old Mason-Dixon line. But each state got 2 senators. In today's world, that's pretty interesting because California and Texas have gigantic populations, yet they only have 2 senators each, even though combined they have about 25% of the U.S. population. They only have 4% of the senators. Actually, that would be 8%. Nope, 4% actually. Utah and New Mexico Territory were created, and notice that Utah Territory is much larger than the modern state of Utah, and notice that New Mexico Territory is much larger than the modern state of New Mexico. Those territories were created, and rather than deciding whether they were going to be slave territories or free territories, they went with this idea called popular sovereignty, which basically said, once enough people move into those territories, we'll let them vote for themselves whether they do or don't want slaves. So in a sense, they were kicking the can down the road, trying to avoid making a decision at this particular point in time because they were afraid of what that would do. So they created a compromise that allowed that decision to be deferred until later. Oregon, hey, we're familiar with that place. Oregon was admitted as a free state. At this point, it was only a territory. Oregon did not become a state until 1859. Valentine's Day, 1859 to be exact, is when Oregon became a state. So we always celebrate statehood on Valentine's Day. And they passed a fugitive slave law. This is something you're going to want to know about. The fugitive slave law was passed, which basically said if any slaves escaped from the south to the north, they had to be returned. And if you did not return the slaves to their masters, you would face very substantial jail time. What ended up happening is the northern states never enforced this, which made the southerners very, very, very mad. But at the time the compromise was passed, it was passed kind of in good faith with a wink and a nod. Yes, we'll pass this fugitive slave law. It will require escaped slaves to be returned to their masters, but in practice, it wasn't enforced very often. And so after this compromise, the problem was there was no place left for the country to expand, and all of these simmering issues between the slave states and the free states were really unresolved, and so the pressure started to build. And so if this is the first installment of 5 installments of this particular unit on the Civil War, what we've done here is we've kind of laid the groundwork for what is to come. And let's just say what is to come is not particularly pretty. At this point, as always, I would like to invite you to write a summary. And as you write that summary, I want you to contemplate 3 important questions. The first is, why was compromise needed? What compromises were made? And what problems did this cause? I'm thinking if you have 5 sentences for that, I will probably be happy, and I might see my way clear to giving you a stamp. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this is once again Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube Network.